This video looks at submissions regarding defective concrete that were made to the Donegal County Development Plan. The video pays particular attention to the issue of temporary accommodation. It turns out that 3 of the 281 submissions concern temporary accommodation. The video explains how submissions are processed by the council planners. At first, Backstory thought an error had been made by the council planners, so a detailed email with specific questions was sent to the council for clarification. The response to that email might not be what you expect. So were provisions for defective concrete actually put into the draft county development plan? Greg Hughes on the 9 till noon show on Highland Radio asked Councillor Nicholas Crossan this question on the 6th of February 2024. Note that there is a link to all Highland Radio clips in the YouTube description of this video.
Say, for instance, you're discussing the county development plan. I mean, does that specifically talk to? And this is not you personally. This is the council. But does that specifically talk to the defective concrete crisis, i.e., particular provisions or exceptions to allow, I don't know, mobile homes on site, or not mobile homes, or the conversion of garages or whatever, or changes to planning permission that might allow different things to happen? I'm throwing stuff out there, but the general question is the county development plan, as you said, an incredibly important meeting today. Does that make specific provision or mention of the defective concrete crisis, for an example?
Yes. And we have set up the defective concrete. It actually, Greg, it was the first committee set up when I became Cahillac in 2019. Was the first committee was the Michael crisis at that time, or the defective brought, headed by our Inishowen man, Martin McDermott, who's doing Trojan work. Martin and Albert and the boys that is involved in that committee report back into the plenary council regarding issues.
But the county development plan does discuss, take account of the defective concrete crisis.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, it has to. It's a huge issue, Greg. It has to take on that there.
No, that's good. I didn't see it, so that's good. That's all right. If it does, it does.
A short while later, an owner of a home with defective concrete, Joy Beard, left a voice note at Highland Radio that had a different view of the county development plan. Joy Beard is a member of the emerging 100% Redress Party.
We had a voice note in from this listener on the back of that interview. Here's what they have to say.
Good morning. I've just been listening to Councillor Crossan's interview. I'm just wondering, could he possibly point us in the direction of where the defective concrete crisis is in the county development plan? I've been through it and I can't find it. I've been through it several times, as have others, and there's no mention of the defective concrete crisis in the county. There is one reference to Micah. It's a single sentence, and it's in relation to a childcare facility if they happen to be affected by Micah. So it'd be good to actually read what exactly the council have in their development plan in relation to the defective concrete crisis, because as we know, there's tens of thousands of people affected by this. So I think it would make interest in reading, but sadly, there's nothing there for us to read as far as I see. So I think Councillor Crossan has got that wrong, I'm afraid.
Okay,
so let's have a look at the draft County Donegal Development Plan and see what references we can find to defective concrete. So if I type in here defective, there are no results. So there's not going to be defective concrete, but we'll just type in concrete to make sure there's nothing there. Concrete, no results. We can try and type in pyrrhotite, no results. What about we type in mica? Okay, we've got 7 results here, and it's picking up mica inside the word economically for the first match. In the next match, economically again, and here we have a mention of mica. And we see that many childcare facilities have been affected by mica. Okay, so that's one reference to mica. Here we've got the word economically again, and economically again. So there's just the one reference to MICA. Okay, let's take a look at how submissions work. Submissions are sent to the Council. The Chief Executive's report is then compiled. A basic short summary should be compiled for each topic in a submission. One original submission was 14 pages in length and contained suggestions on many different topics. Each topic in a multi-page submission should get its own entry like this. Here we are looking at a topic from a submission from an organization called Defending Environmental Wealth. However, if topics from different organizations concern the same issue, their summaries can be grouped together. In this case, you would see a second organization name in the header row, and there'd be a second summary in the second row. The Chief Executive then gives their response. Then the Chief Executive gives their recommendation. In this case, it was to insert a new section into the draft county development plan. It could also be to remove certain sentences from the draft plan, or it could be to not do anything to the draft plan. It's important to take note of the last line in this submission, which says, quote, "This is considered to be a material alteration," unquote. At this stage, material alterations, which are changes that the Chief Executive thinks are important, go out for public consultation. However, non-material changes, which are changes that the Chief Executive thinks are less important, do not go out for public consultation. One senior planner told me that these non-material or less important changes are usually voted for en bloc. That is, councillors cast a single vote to approve all non-material or less important changes in one go. Another senior planner, not from Donegal County Council, has told me that councillors do not have to agree with this en bloc voting. Even if the chair of a county council suggests that all non-material alterations or less important changes should be voted for en bloc, that is, in one vote, any councillor has the right to challenge that suggestion and request for a specific topic to be discussed separately and to be voted upon separately. In fact, in this clip from the council meeting on the 6th of February 2024, you can see councillors voting on what they are told by Mr. Liam Ward are non-contentious issues. Non-contentious, non-material, less important issues to the County Development Plan. Mr. Ward is Director of Community Development and Planning Services. Mr. Ward then hands off to Mr. Paul Christie, who appears to manage the vote, which only took seconds. One would be forgiven for being suspicious that the screen is filled with a computer presentation when the votes are cast. Mr. Christie works in the Central Planning Unit. The Redress Focus Group submission and the Northern and Western Regional Assemblies submission regarding temporary accommodation are listed as item 6.1 Housing Strategy in the presentation shown in this clip.
So, for the purposes of today, members, what we're proposing to do is to take you through the sections of the Chief Executive's report 2 to 16. First of all, in relation to the proposed non-material alterations, then those that are material and which would require to go out for a further period of public consultation, other issues that have been identified, and then obviously open to the members to raise other issues as they see fit. So, I'm going to hand over to Paul now to take you through the detail of this. And what I would say is that on the material alterations, once we talk in relation to the detail of that, we will require the members to resolve that we consider those non-material and to make those changes to the Chief Executive's, to the draft plan before it goes out to further period of public consultation. Yeah, I think so. And there will be an opportunity at the end of each chapter for members' comments.
Just for the record, Councillor Michael Cullen Miguel Aspig would like said he want to be removed from any discussion regarding one farm, so he just wants that on the record. Okay. All right. Thanks. Sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Liam. Members, Obviously, we'll get into the material alterations in a lot of detail in the next few minutes. Just to say as well, there are 37 recommendations in relation to what we call non-material alterations throughout all of the chapters there that are on the screen. We like to think none of those are too contentious. They're all in the Chief Executive's report, and I suppose because they're non-contentious and therefore non-material, we're looking for members' support for those collectively at this point in time.
Happy enough to proceed? Yeah.
Yep.
Into detail. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, members. Next slide. Yeah. On Chapter 2, Vision and Ambition.
While it was not possible to see the councillors vote, there was no indication in the audio that any councillor from any party or independent raised any objection to the so-called, quote, non-contentious, unquote, non-material issue of temporary alternative accommodation. But to continue with the example we are looking at from the Chief Executive's report. Here, the change is material, so the Chief Executive has decided that he thinks this is an important change, and important material changes have to go out for public consultation. In fact, all material or important changes to the Donegal County Development Plan are currently out for public consultation until the 5th of April 2024 inclusive. Note that only these proposed material alterations or important changes can be commented upon by the public. The public cannot make new submissions at this time. If you want to see the material important changes that have been proposed for the current draft county development plan that are currently out for public consultation, please see the link in the video description. At this point, I'd like to make a brief announcement about Backstory.ie before we continue with this absolutely mad story. Those who follow my journalism regularly will know that I am a one-person operation and that all my reporting so far has all been voluntary. Much of my reporting has been to dig out publicly available material, particularly Oireachtas videos. I have transcribed most of them myself and have often created detailed indexes so that viewers can easily find information without having to search back and forth in the video. This makes it extremely easy for other journalists and researchers to inform themselves using this very time-consuming work of mine. Whenever I've used bits from other journalists, I've always put in links to the source material. I hope that others will treat my work in the same manner. I've done a considerable amount of travelling too, not least driving from Buncrana to Dublin and back for the press conference that was held by the EU Petitions Committee last year. And then a few days later, another trip from Buncrana to Athlone and back for the Sinn Féin Ardèche. This report, to my mind, is very significant and is a 100% breaking news story for Backstory.ie. I hope other news media will consider this story worth repeating. Of course, I'm happy for other paid journalists and paid researchers to use my work to inform themselves and spread the word about this awful cancer called defective concrete. All I ask is to be credited as, quote, Backstory.ie, unquote, in print. In digital media, I would be asked to be credited with the link to the words Backstory.ie that, when clicked on, opens the video that is being used by the journalist or researcher. I feel privileged to be able to count Donald McNamee of the Business Post and Mark Tighe of the Sunday Independent as followers of mine on X.com or Twitter. I also feel privileged to be able to count some staff at the Market Surveillance Office as some of my followers. There are also a number of politicians who follow Backstory.ie. However, Backstory.ie cannot keep doing this work voluntarily. It is intended to set up some means of accepting donations in the not-too-distant future. When that is set up, I hope you might consider donating from time to time. Thanks a bunch, but now on with the rest of this crazy story. So why is there a need for temporary accommodation? A family cannot live in their defective home while it is being remediated. This is especially true if the family home has to be demolished. Scientists from across the world, including Switzerland, Canada, the USA, and Norway, attended the International Conference on Science and Societal Impacts of Defective Concrete Blocks that was hosted by Ulster University, the Atlantic Technological University, and MEP Luke Ming Flanagan back in November 2022. The scientists subsequently issued a peer-reviewed academic paper stating that the cracking and crumbling in Donegal was found to be primarily due to the presence of iron sulfides, particularly an iron sulfide called pyrrhotite. Note that in other parts of the country, a different iron sulfide, pyrite, has been identified as the main problem mineral causing defects in concrete. Backstory.ie has prepared a minute-by-minute index to the 8-hour International Concrete Conference video. You can choose to see the talk on how defective concrete is affecting students and teachers in schools, for example, or you could look at the excellent talk by Dr. Andreas Lehmann from Switzerland, where he explains why the government's assertion that mica is the main problem is incorrect. This index and a link to the peer-reviewed scientific paper is in the video description. The only viable solution to homes cracking and crumbling due to iron sulfides is demolition. First, you have to think about how quickly defective concrete homes are being remediated. If the rate of remediations is slow, then fewer remediations will be carried out and less alternative temporary accommodation will be required to house families whose homes are being rebuilt. If the rate of remediations is fast, then more remediations will be carried out and more temporary accommodation will be required to house families whose homes are being rebuilt. The slower the speed of remediations, the longer this crisis will continue. The slower the speed of remediation, the longer housing estates across the country will remain dangerous construction sites. So how quickly are defective concrete homes being remediated? Brian Dobson from RT's News at 1 questioned Housing Minister Darragh O'Brien in January 2024 about the apparent slow progress of the so-called enhanced defective concrete scheme. Note that despite RTE paying their staff very good wages, despite RTE having dedicated research teams, and despite RTE's remit to serve the people of Ireland, this interview is demonstrative of the national broadcaster's lack of knowledge of the defective concrete crisis, which they've been reporting on since at least 2016, when Primetime did a special report on this crisis.
You'd think to look at it as a good block, but you look, it's not that good. You know what I mean? So no house could stay up with that there, like.
Tonight on Primetime, why are houses in Donegal visibly crumbling and what can be done to help the families forced from their homes?
My children are not safe. We will have to move out of this house eventually.
There is a link to the full 2016 Primetime report in the video description. But back to Mr. Dobson's interview with Housing Minister Darragh O'Brien. Mr. Dobson did not have the knowledge to challenge the minister's spin in this interview. How many problems do you identify with Mr. Dobson's questioning?
The Irish Independent reported the weekend that just 43 homeowners in Donegal had applied for the remediation scheme for defective mica, the mica scheme that was introduced. It seems to indicate that this is something that just isn't working. It doesn't seem to be fit for purpose if the numbers are so small.
I think you'll see in that report, Brian, it related as well to the drawdown of grants where people are actually applying where works have been completed. And it's really good to see that work's underway and increased applications to the new scheme. Because I gave a commitment to affected residents back in 2020 that we would improve the scheme. So we upped the cap from 247,000 to 420,000, 100% redress. Our housing agency team are on the ground in Donegal. And we are seeing, not just in Donegal, but in Mayo as well, Brian, a very significant increase in the number of applications to the scheme.
Yeah, but is it actually 100%? Because people have to find the cost of renting when they're out and the work is being done, for example, and they also have to meet, I think, some upfront costs as well.
Very little. Again, the original scheme, you had very significant upfront costs of €6,000, which I got rid of. That's gone. In relation to other accommodation costs like rental, again, we've increased the expenses allowed there up to €15,000. Now, we want this scheme to work, and it is taking hold there. There are very good improvements to the scheme, and really just to help people ensure that they're accessing the scheme and that there are no barriers to access it. And thankfully, as I said, we're seeing the first properties, being completed there now. And people have lived with this problem for a long number of years. The state has stepped in, rightly so, because of market failure. And the scheme is actually taking hold across the affected region, not just in Donegal, but in Mayo. And I expect to expand the scheme very shortly to 3 further counties.
Okay, because there was this recent report or draft report from the European Parliament saying that it does need to be improved. It talked about the need for a widening of the scheme and reducing the red tape.
Yeah, it did. I actually met with the committee when they came over, and in that report as well, they were actually very positive about the scheme and the engagement that they had with myself and my officials. So we've done our level best to reduce the red tape, as you put it. Obviously, it's a very significant grant, up to €420,000. So some paperwork and verification is absolutely needed. I think most people will understand that. But we have broadened the scheme, and I will be extending it to further counties now in the coming weeks, further counties where we've received submissions in, much lesser, not the same numbers that we would have in Donegal or indeed Mayo, but in counties such as other counties then that we've expanded it to already, such as Clare and Limerick, and I expect 2 or 3 other counties to come into it shortly.
They might be
look, the counties themselves. Well, the submissions, like I'm looking at Sligo. There's some homes in Sligo, actually, small number of homes in Fingal as well, and there are individual homes in some other counties as well. Like how this works effectively is that if a homeowner believes that they're affected by this, that they would contact their local authority. The local authority then would complete submissions to me, trying to identify the number of homes, and then it comes up. And the legislation that I brought the changes to the original scheme that I brought forward, should I say, ensures in the legislation that we can add counties to the scheme. So, this has been a long road for homeowners, and I'm conscious of that. It was a scheme that I inherited, that we've improved, that we've upped the grant on, and that now is actually having an effect that residents' homes are now getting remediated.
There are many problems with how Mr. Dobson questioned the minister, but Backstory.ie will not be doing an analysis of these problems in this report. Suffice it to say that the main issue is that the minister's spin went unchallenged because Mr. Dobson was not familiar with the defective concrete crisis that is affecting homes in at least 13 counties in Ireland. There is a link to the full clip on the RT website in the video description. The day after this interview, Owen O'Brien, the Sinn Féin spokesperson on housing, was interviewed by Greg Hughes on the Highland Radio 9 till noon show. Here are 2 people who are actually familiar with the defective concrete crisis. Note that Mr. O'Brien specifies the actual real number of people applying to the scheme. He uses figures that he got from Minister O'Brien's own Department of Housing. Contrast these real figures with the minister's assertion that, quote, applications have increased, unquote.
Owen O'Brien, Sinn Féin housing spokesperson, do you recognise that the scheme as described by Dara O'Brien on RTE yesterday?
I don't, Greg, and I think not just me, but most affected homeowners in Donegal and Mayo, Limerick, Clare, Sligo and elsewhere wouldn't have recognised it. Last week I received very detailed information from Dara O'Brien by way of a parliamentary question, giving us an update on the number of people who've applied for the revised scheme since it opened last summer, the number of people in the scheme overall, and the total number of households since the scheme opened in 2020 who've received the full grant. And the figures from the minister's own department tell a completely different story. We've had only 54 fully remediated homes across the affected counties since 2020. Only 43 of those were in Donegal. But probably the most concerning figure that was in the parliamentary question was since the new revised scheme opened last summer. This was the scheme that Dara O'Brien, if you remember, rushed through the legislation in 2022 and said it was going to solve all of the problems of the earlier scheme. Only 236 homeowners, 160 of whom are in Donegal, have applied in 6 months.
Owen O'Brien said that nationwide 54 homes have been fully remediated since the first 90/10 scheme was introduced in 2020. That's 54 homes remediated in 4 years, which is an average of 13 homes being rebuilt per year. So how many homes are actually affected? A 14-page submission made by a state body called the Northern and Western Regional Assembly sheds some light on this matter. The submission covered several topics on the issue of defective concrete in Donegal. But what is a regional assembly? There are 3 regional assemblies in Ireland: the Eastern and Midland Regional Assembly, the Southern Regional Assembly, and the Northern and Western Regional Assembly. Regional assemblies sit between the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage and local authorities or councils. Minister Darragh O'Brien's department formulates what's called the National Planning Framework, which is a strategic plan that guides the long-term development of the country up until 2040. One of the main roles of regional assemblies is to provide guidance to councils within their jurisdiction on implementing the National Planning Framework in a way that benefits the whole region. The headquarters of the Northern and Western Regional Assembly is located in the small town of Ballahadureen, County Roscommon, and has a workforce of 18 people. In fact, Backstory called into the NWAR office in Roscommon in person earlier this year. Backstory.ie just called in on spec to find out more about the NWRA. Unfortunately, there were not any senior staff there who could go on record with me at the time. The NWRA is comprised of 25 elected members nominated by the 9 local authorities within the region. The NWRA covers 8 counties: Galway, Roscommon, Leitrim, Sligo, Donegal, Monaghan, Mayo and Cavan, and works closely with the local authorities who manage these counties. Councillor Patrick McGowan, Councillor Jack Murray and Councillor Frank McBrearty represent Donegal at the Northern and Western Regional Assembly. Backstory.ie has learned that while local authorities are obliged to take into consideration the views of the Regional Assembly, the local authority can also ignore these views. This seems rather strange. It's a sort of which comes first, the chicken or the egg scenario, or perhaps it could be described as who's the boss of who. Backstory was told that the 700-page Planning and Development Bill 2023 may address this issue. The Planning and Development Bill 2023 has completed the second stage in the Dáil. There are links to the following websites in the video description. 1. The Northern and Western Regional Assembly. 2. The National Planning Framework. 3. An announcement of the Planning and Development Bill 2023 at the Department of Housing website. And 4. A webpage from Oireachtas.ie showing the history of this bill through the Dáil. So let's look at some of the issues that were raised by the Northern and Western Regional Assembly's submission to the Donegal County Development Plan. So what estimates are there for the number of defective concrete properties in Donegal? The NWRA submission refers to 5,800 homes, as you can see here. This figure, in turn, is from the Department of Housing report for the Working Group on the Defective Concrete Blocks Grant Scheme that was published in September 2021, which states that the estimated potential number of private homes affected is 4,800 and the estimated number of social housing units affected is 1,000. It is interesting to note that the Department of Housing is willing to base a scheme costing multiple billions of euro without having ever done any boots-on-the-ground survey of affected properties. The figure of 5,800 houses is likely to be very conservative. In an interview conducted with Donegal County Councillor Martin McDermott for Backstory.ie's Upsetting Concrete podcast in February 2023, Councillor McDermott said that he believes there are up to 10,000 homes affected on the Inishowen Peninsula alone. Do you have any friends or family that are affected by defective concrete blocks?
Yeah, all my friends and family and myself. Where I live, everybody's affected. There's hundreds of houses around me, so all friends, family, neighbours, the whole of Inishowen in particular. Like we have probably somewhere in the region of 10,000 homes affected, so everywhere you go, everywhere you turn, there's affected homes, so you can't get away from that.
The councillor's figure was substantially higher than any estimates that have come from the Department of Housing. Councillor McDermott is the chair of the Donegal County Council Steering Group on Defective Concrete. He also lives in Inishowen. This should mean that he is in a position to be more knowledgeable than anyone else on estimates of defective concrete homes in Inishowen. And remember, there are still other communities in Donegal that are also affected with defective concrete homes, which means the true figure is likely to be bigger again. These figures also only refer to defective concrete homes. Minister Darragh O'Brien and his team of civil servants have made no provision for the crumbling of other types of properties like business premises, farm buildings, community centres, schools and more. In fact, if you visit the council buildings in Condonna in North Inishowen, in addition to seeing defective concrete cracking in the exterior walls, you will find this serious crack in one of the men's toilets inside the building. This raises the following questions. Does this crack extend from the ground floor through the first and second floors all the way to the roof? How many other cracks are there in these council buildings that are not visible in public areas? Do internal cracks like these have any implications for the health and safety of staff working in these council buildings? To listen to the full interview with Councillor McDermott, see the link to Backstory.ie's Upsetting Concrete podcast in the video description. There are also links to the NWRA submission and to the report from the working group on the Defective Concrete Blocks grant scheme that was referenced from September 2021. A family will have to live in alternative temporary accommodation for as long as it takes to remediate their home. So how long does it take to remediate a home? The Department of Housing have stated in their June 2023 Your Questions Answered document that they are allowing 65 weeks to remediate a home. 65 weeks is the same as 15 months or 1 year and 3 months. However, one homeowner I've spoken with who has a larger house has told me that 65 weeks would not be long enough to rebuild his house. Let's be optimistic and say that to demolish and rebuild a home will take just 1 year. If 500 homes were remediated each year, it would take 20 years to complete the remediation of 10,000 homes. If we use the conservative figure of 5,800 homes with defective concrete that was mentioned in the government's working group report from 2021, and if still 500 homes were rebuilt each year, it would still take over 11 and a half years to resolve the crisis in Donegal. As mentioned before, a family cannot live in their home while it is being remediated, especially if it is being demolished. So for each year for 20 years, 500 rental properties would be required every year to house the 10,000 families whose homes are being remediated in Inishowen alone. But is this figure of being able to remediate 500 homes a year reasonable? Is that a lot or is that a little? We can get some indication of what is reasonable or unreasonable from the NWRA submission, which looks at the housing strategy in the Donegal County Development Plan. The NWRA submission suggests that housing output would need to be trebled if the council is to meet its own targets. The NWRA goes on to say that with increased mortgage and increased loan interest rates, shortages in the supply of building materials, increased inflation and increased labour costs, it would appear to be a considerable challenge to extend output of units in line with the output ambition of the council. And because the county development plan has no provision for defective concrete of any kind, the projected 500 homes that would need to be remediated each year would be extra to that trebling. We can get more information from looking at this section of the housing strategy in the Donegal County Development Plan. In the first abridged table, we can see that the council's housing supply targets for the 6 years from 2024 to 2030 are a total of 7,678 households. and 7,678 divided by 6 gives 1,280. It's the average number of households the council expects will be built each year for the next 6 years. In the second table, we can see how many new dwellings were actually built in previous years. And in fact, new house completions went down from 580 in 2020 to 479 in 2021. As you can see here, the council itself says this will require a significant increase in housing output over and above that delivered in recent years. So Donegal County Council is suggesting that housing output should go from 479 in 2021 to 1,280 for each year from 2024 to 2030. In addition to that, if 500 homeowners need somewhere to live while their homes are being remediated each year, then housing demand will be the council's predicted demand of 1,280 plus the 500 homes being remediated that they made no provision for in the county development plan, bringing the total housing demand to 1,780, and this will be up from 479 in 2021. Donegal County Council believes that target is attainable despite the fact that the Minister for Education, Simon Harris, was pleading for construction workers to return to Ireland to help solve the housing crisis in February 2024. There are links in the video description for the Your Questions Answered document from the Department of Housing and the Independent newspaper article. Is the council being overly optimistic? What do you think? Okay, despite the fact that only 43 homes were remediated in Donegal in the first 4 years from the first scheme in 2020 until now, let's imagine that 500 families are currently getting their homes remediated. So they'll be looking for a rental property for a year. For a family, we'll be talking about 2-bedroomed and 3-bedroomed homes. Let's see what rental properties are available in Inishowen today. How many 2-bedroomed and 3-bedroom homes are there in Donegal on the 23rd of March 2024? So let's look for properties that are 2 bedrooms. Okay, and so there are 4 2-bedroom properties. We've got Letterkenny. So Letterkenny is not in the peninsula of Inishowen, which is here. We've got Letterkenny again, Letterkenny and Brockaclochen. So Brockaclochen is over here. Okay, so that's not in Inishowen. So if we go and look at 3-bedroom homes, we'll go here, we'll up the max to 3, the minimum to 3. And we've got 7 properties. We've got Letterkenny again. Now we've got Dunlow. So where is Dunlow? Dunlow is over there. And we've got Lifford. Okay, so where's Lifford? Lifford is not in the peninsula of Inishowen. And we've also got Mount Charles, which is over there. Okay, and so Letterkenny again. Okay, so there's absolutely 0 properties on the peninsula of Inishowen. 0 properties to rent. Minister Darragh O'Brien and his department have also dictated that any remediated home has to be built on the exact same footprint as the original house. At the recent People's Document meeting that took place on the 4th of March 2024 in Burt, Donegal, a homeowner explained why this demand from Minister O'Brien, combined with having to travel from rented accommodation to schools and to work, is unreasonable.
I'm delighted to see side by side in the document. I hope that can stay because that really affects us. We live in the countryside. My kids do not want to move to the town.
Yeah.
And the nearest place we can get to rent is about 12 kilometres from my home and 20 kilometres from their school. and the bus doesn't even go that far. So we have plenty of room on our site to build side by side, and it doesn't cost the state anything. And it might mean nothing to a lot of people here who don't have room in their site, but then we wouldn't be taking up their spots of a rental property when we can easily build side by side and then let that rental property go for somebody who hasn't got the option on their site. Also, my husband is part of a family of farmers, so he physically can't be 20 or 12 to 20 kilometres away in the middle of the night to go and see to livestock and lambing season and all of that. So I hope that side by side can stay and that we do get it, because there's no reason why we shouldn't get it, because we've been through hell and back and we need to get it.
There is a link to that full People's Document meeting in the video description. Backstory sent a detailed email looking for clarification on several submissions regarding temporary alternative accommodation, and we will discuss those in more detail later, but it is appropriate to include this answer from the Council here. The Council stated that if homeowners can't source private rented accommodation in their own locality, then the community facilitators would help them find accommodation in neighbouring counties. The only neighbouring county Donegal has is County Sligo. And if we take a look at a map, we can see that this is not going to be feasible for the 10,000 homeowners that live in Inishowen. A trip from Clondonagh to the Sligo border takes 1 hour and 50 minutes, which is just under a 4-hour round trip. And a trip from Clondonagh to Sligo town takes 2.5 hours, which is a 5-hour round trip. What kind of planning is this? Homeowners also require storage facilities to keep, for example, their furniture while they are living in temporary alternative accommodation as their home is being rebuilt. In addition to storage facilities being required for furniture, some homeowners are trying to salvage as much as they can from their original home. Perhaps roof trusses, roof tiles, kitchen units, etc. could be salvaged, even though the process of removing many of these items from a defective home will most likely damage them and make them unusable. In February 2024, a homeowner explained the difficulties involved with finding adequate storage facilities to Greg Hughes on Highland Radio's 9 till Noon show.
We have had to make our own plans for storage. There's no storage space available anywhere in Letterkenny. So we had to go and we had to buy a shed. We haven't got space on our land. We live in an estate in Ramelton. We haven't got space on our land to put in a big storage container. So we had to go and buy a shed. We had to clear an area in the garden. We had to move our oil tank, which consequently has left us with no heating for the last 2 weeks. We had to move our oil tank. We put the shed in. We filled the shed with all the stuff from the house. We've been told that this may not fall under applicable costs in the scheme. The scheme does provide €5,000 for storage, but we have been told that this may not qualify as an applicable cost. So we could be left with that bill ourselves.
On a related but different matter, there was a bit of good news in the answers Backstory.ie received from Donegal County Council on the 15th of March 2024. That is that mobile homes can be purchased with the 15,000 ancillary grant for alternative accommodation. And this grant of 15,000 can also be used for the conversion of existing garages and sheds into alternative accommodation. However, as homeowners well know at this stage, when it comes to deciphering terms and conditions laid down by the Department of Housing, why make anything simple when you can ruin a completely good idea with red tape? The use of the alternative accommodation ancillary grant is, quote, subject to the applicant's compliance with the provisions of the DCP grant scheme payment claims process, unquote. Backstory is aware of at least one problem associated with this. In an email received from one of the Donegal facilitators at the Inishowen Development Partnership on the 19th of March 2024, it was stated that any mobile home would have to be purchased from a tax-compliant company. I think you can see where this is going, right? Backstory.ie replied to this email on the same day with this. A homeowner starting out on their remediation won't be able to purchase a mobile home from another homeowner who has finished their remediation because the ancillary grant can only be used to purchase mobile homes from tax-compliant companies. And most homeowners would not have a tax-compliant company that sells mobile homes. Backstory has not yet received a reply to that email as this video is being put together. There is potentially a tsunami of homeowners going to require alternative accommodation all at the same time if the rate of remediation does not ramp up to numbers in the hundreds of remediations per year. Backstory.ie has met many homeowners who say, "My property is not as bad as the others I've seen, those should get fixed first." And these homeowners have been more than willing to wait for their own property to deteriorate enough to satisfy the totally unscientific visual building condition assessment. This assessment is where building professionals visually assess the widths of cracks in a wall. This is totally devoid of any science regarding the actual mineral composition of the aggregate used in concrete blocks in the walls and in the poured concrete foundations. The extremely slow to almost non-existent rate of remediation currently means that more and more homes are going to become more and more dangerous to live in. This will eventually force homeowners to live elsewhere. Homeowners in this position and who are lucky enough to qualify for the €15,000 temporary alternative accommodation grant will end up having to use this money for alternative accommodation, even though works have not yet commenced on their remediation. These homeowners will end up having less than 65 weeks within which to remediate their homes. Note that not all homes will qualify for the ancillary grants, which is supposed to be in addition to the square meter rate for the remediation of their home. Look at this explanation in the Your Questions Answered document. By the way, anyone wanting further verification of this can find the same information in the legislation. If the square meter grant rate, plus the addition of any of the ancillary grants, goes over the 420,000 cap, you end up with just the cap amount for any amount that exceeds the cap. To be clear, someone whose square meter rate is €395,000 will be allowed the three ancillary grants of $5,000 for storage, $5,000 for emergency repairs, and $15,000 for alternative accommodation. The ancillary grants come to €25,000 and added to the square meter rate of $395,000 comes out at the cap of $420,000. This makes no sense. First of all, there shouldn't be a cap. A homeowner paid good money for their building materials, whatever size of house they built. But if Minister Dara O'Brien wanted a cap, it would at least be fair to cap the square meter rates at $420,000, but still allow the ancillary grants as extra payments. One has to wonder if the bus driver of this fiasco even has a license to do the job. The need for temporary alternative accommodation should be clear. It's not rocket science. Now let's look at what submissions to the Donegal County Development Plan were made that concern temporary alternative accommodation for homeowners who will be getting their homes remediated. Northwest Modern Designs made a submission on behalf of their client Harkin Developments. The submission was looking to get agricultural/rural land rezoned for housing. This submission said that temporary accommodation could be provided to rehouse homeowners while their homes are being remediated. The submission said that up to 120 modular housing units or 80 permanent units could be built for this purpose. The Chief Executive's response said that the issue of emergency accommodation needs can be, quote, dealt with under emergency legislation as and when the need arises, unquote. To Backstory.ie, this appears to be planning to have an emergency as opposed to planning to avoid an emergency. The Chief Executive said the issue of emergency accommodation is dealt with elsewhere in this report, and we will analyse that later in this video. The Redress Focus Groups and the Northern and Western Regional Assembly, or NWRA, Both made submissions referring to temporary alternative accommodation. The submissions from both organisations were grouped together in the Chief Executive Officer's report. By the way, please pause the video if you need time to read the submissions. The redress focus groups were set up by Roisin Gallagher to harness the many expertises and experiences of the local community. This particular redress focus group submission was authored by Shane Doherty, an architect based in Clonmany. One of the redress focus group submissions suggested that if a housing estate had a green area, a few modular homes could be built in the green area. Services like water, gas and electricity could be diverted from a home undergoing remediation to the modular homes. This would save on costs as these services are essentially already there. Homeowners could take turns to occupy these modular homes as their homes are being remediated. The modular homes could be removed afterwards and the green area could be restored. Another suggestion from the redress focus groups was for the council to provide services like water, gas and electricity to council land that is intended to be used for council housing in the future. Modular housing could be quickly built on this land, and the owners of one-off homes in the neighbouring area could occupy this modular housing as their own homes are being remediated. Once all homes in the area have been remediated, the modular housing could be removed. And now the council have a social housing site which has services like water, gas and electricity already installed, again saving the council money. The redress focus group suggested that storage facilities could be provided in a similar manner. The redress focus groups also made a general request to the council to think about and to plan for how Donegal will be affected by defective concrete and to mitigate the terrible impact defective concrete is having on the people who live in Donegal. The planners in Donegal County Council get paid well to predict what is coming down the tracks for the people of the county and to make appropriate plans that will best cope with these issues. The councillors vote on the recommendations of the council planners and they dictate what should be in the county plan. Planning is not the job of volunteer citizens to undertake. After all, you're supposed to attend university these days to become a planner. But when the council planners, in conjunction with county councillors, lack common sense, what else can a homeowner do? Only make a submission. It's then a very sorry state of affairs when the Chief Executive's report also rejects plain common sense. As mentioned previously, the Northern and Western Regional Assembly made a 14-page submission to the Donegal County Development Plan. The submission covered many topics, including some regarding defective concrete. Before we look at the NWRA submission, let's have a brief look at the credentials of the people making the submission. Firstly, the submission was emailed in by Mr. Conall McGettigan, who is a senior planner at the NWRA. Note that the reductions here were made by Donegal County Council. The NWRA submission was also signed by Mr. Dennis Kelly. Mr. Kelly is the director at the NWRA. It is important to note that Mr. Kelly has particularly important credentials that make his views even more relevant regarding the situation in Donegal. Not only has he worked in the NWRA for 8 years, but he was also a senior planner and senior executive planner for 9 years in Donegal County Council. With the NWRA submission having the backing of Mr. Dennis Kelly and Mr. Conall McGettigan, Donegal County Council would be foolish to ignore it. Before we look specifically at the NWRA's recommendations regarding temporary accommodation, we shall take this opportunity to briefly look at all the other recommendations regarding defective concrete in the NWRA submission. The NWRA provided a general statement that due to the scale of the defective concrete problem and the impact the crisis will have on housing output, defective concrete should form part of the considerations in the county development plan. Donegal County councillors did not put anything about this in the county development plan. The NWRA warned of a shortage of construction labour and skills. Donegal County councillors did not put anything about this in the county development plan. The NWRA said that the county development plan did not consider the management of demolition waste. Donegal County councillors did not put anything about this in the county development plan. In fact, Backstory wonders if demolition waste containing high quantities of iron sulfides, which produces sulfuric acid, might make the waste a hazardous waste as opposed to a non-hazardous waste. Has this been considered by the council? And finally now, the NWRA submission regarding temporary accommodation. The NWRA recognises that there will be a large number of families that will be displaced as their homes are reconstructed. And the NWRA foresees that modular emergency accommodation may have to be provided. Donegal County councillors did not put anything about this in the county development plan. Let's look at how the redress focus groups and the Northern and Western Regional Assemblies submissions appeared grouped together in the Chief Executive's report. While the summaries include somewhat more than only temporary accommodation is the main thing that this video is concerned with. First, this is what the summaries look like. Next, we will look at the CE's response. Here is the full response, but we will break this down bit by bit. The Chief Executive says, "It is not anticipated that the crisis will generate the need for any significant additional housing units over and above regular demand, as most affected units will either be replaced on a like-for-like basis or remediated through partial reconstruction. However, say 500 homes are being remediated in 2025. This would mean that a significant number of additional housing units would be needed to house these 500 families while their homes are being remediated. Let's assume these 500 families did manage to find rental accommodation. The council have not provided for this eventuality, which means that the council will now have to deal with the extra pressure of finding accommodation for the 500 families they thought would be housed without any defective concrete problem. There is clearly a need for significant housing units over and above regular demand. Whether or not affected units are either replaced on a like-for-like basis or remediated through partial reconstruction is irrelevant to their significant need for further housing. The Chief Executive says there are separate provisions under the Enhanced Defective Concrete Blocks Grant Scheme in relation to funding for homeowners in respect of sourcing alternative accommodation as well as storage costs. The Chief Executive is referring to the ancillary grants amounts of $15,000 for temporary accommodation and $5,000 for storage. But it doesn't matter how much grant money you get for temporary accommodation if there are no homes to rent and no storage facilities to rent. Here the Chief Executive says, should the need for multiple temporary accommodation units arise, the planning approach will be to deal with the issue as an emergency. This statement from the Chief Executive shows that he does not believe that it is inevitable that the need for multiple temporary accommodation units will arise. If the Chief Executive thinks that the rate of remediation of homes in Donegal will stay at 43 homes since the 2020 90-10 scheme, or in other words, about 10 homes a year on average, then his statement might hold true. But if 500 homes are being remediated each year, there will be 500 extra families to house somewhere while their home is being rebuilt. And as we've seen from looking at Defective.ie previously, there were only 32 homes to rent in the whole of Donegal at the time of making this video. The Chief Executive says, should the need for multiple temporary accommodation units arise, the planning approach will be to deal with the issue as an emergency. In a follow-up email to Donegal County Council, I asked, is it not the case that the Chief Executive is planning to have an emergency as opposed to planning to prevent an emergency? The Council's response was just to refer me again to the Chief Executive statement that we are currently discussing. Now the Chief Executive mentions social houses that are affected with defective concrete. If the rate at which social homes are being remediated also increases, this too will create a further need for significant housing units over and above regular demand. What kind of planning is this? The Chief Executive's recommendation had nothing to do with temporary accommodation, but it is included here for completeness. Basically, the Chief Executive said that the Council will provide guidance on remediation options to assist with planning compliance, and that the Council will provide support for assessing and managing affected properties in line with the 2022 legislation on remediation of dwellings damaged by defective concrete blocks. And then it is worth acknowledging that the Chief Executive said he sees this as a non-material issue, and so this lack of any provision for temporary accommodation won't be out for the current public consultation. There is a link to the Chief Executive's report in the video description. Donegal architect Shane Doherty, who authored the Redress Focus Group submission, sent Backstory a formal response to the Chief Executive's report. I will read Mr. Doherty's 3 points and his summary. 1. The response that the crisis will not generate any significant additional housing need, as the houses will be replaced like for like, completely misses the point of the homeowners and their families having to move out of their house while it is being rebuilt. This period, at very best case, would be 6 to 7 months for timber frame rebuild, and in most cases will be 12 months or more for traditional masonry build. There is already a housing crisis throughout the country, of which Donegal has not been immune to. Therefore, I cannot understand how he can say the crisis will not add additional housing need when you consider the sheer quantity of homes that are affected and the short-term accommodation that they will all need. 2. His statement regarding the defective concrete block scheme providing funding for alternative accommodation again misses the overall point, in that there is a massive need for alternative accommodation. Also, the point regarding dealing with alternative temporary accommodation on an emergency basis goes against the premise of a development plan. The idea of the development plan is to be proactive over the next 6-year period in how the county deals with development in all its elements. Yet the one major development issue that this county will be dealing with over the next 6 years and beyond, when you weigh up the number of properties affected and the value of grants potentially allocated to each, is going to be dealt with as an emergency reactive measure rather than planning for it. 3. The last item is how this submission was deemed non-material, thereby essentially saying that this submission and ultimately its contents are not that important and can be dealt with in the same way as other minor concerns. Summary. In summary, I believe the Chief Executive's response is simply noted to tick the box that the development plan has acknowledged the submission. Backstory is awaiting a response from the Northern and Western Regional Assembly to the Chief Executive's report and the Chief Executive's decision to treat the issue of temporary alternative accommodation with emergency legislation should the need for temporary accommodation arise. When Backstory.ie gets its reply from the NWRA, it will be posted as a separate video. Can anything be done to change the Donegal County Development Plan at this stage? Maybe. It is possible to make a complaint to ombudsman.ie for matters concerning a local authority. Perhaps changes could be forced into the county development plan. However, first you have to tell someone in Donegal County Council that you are not happy with the county development plan and explain why. If you get an unsatisfactory response, you have to make a complaint to someone in Donegal County Council. If there is an appeals process in the council, you have to go through that appeals process. If you then get an unsatisfactory reply to your complaint, or if you have had no reply after 6 weeks, only then can you make a complaint to ombudsman.ie. It is important to not be abusive and to remain polite. However, do obviously outline the ridiculous facts. Note that it is okay for advocates working with complainants to make complaints on behalf of others if the complainant has formally given written consent for that. It might be good to put any complaint in writing to info@donegalcoco.ie. If you don't know to whom you should address your complaint, you can ring 074 91 53900 to ask that. The emails for people working in Donegal County Council are the first letter of the first name followed immediately by second name at donegalcoco.ie. For example, Joe Bloggs would have the email address jbloggs@donegalcoco.ie. Despite all the difficulties facing homeowners, which on the one hand are the defective concrete cancer eating away at so many families' homes, and on the other hand, the totally unempathetic, passive-aggressive bureaucracy at council and national level, I hope homeowners remember their strengths. As Luke Flanagan said at the International Concrete Conference in Letterkenny in November 2022,
the biggest thing that sticks out for me today is, and it really does stick out, how many really professional and competent people we have in this county, not alone in the country, like just from the people who spoke specifically from Donegal today. I've heard more professionalism and more excellence than you'd need to run a country, let alone what they do in their own lives. So it isn't a question that we don't have the expertise or the knowledge or the intelligence to do things right in Ireland. Today, you've seen here that the Irish people are smart. The problem is you have the wrong people there pulling the levers and the wrong people who make the decisions.
Keep fighting. This has been Backstory.ie.